Hello and welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. This is episode 97. I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. If I were to ask you to picture in your mind a medieval hospital or orphanage or leprosarium, which is a institution to house people who are afflicted with what was considered leprosy in the Middle Ages, you would probably picture something pretty grim. In fact, you would probably do that if I asked you to picture any pre-modern version of those institutions, and even many modern ones. But what if, in the case that interests us the most, and here we're talking about Constantinople, but also some other cities in the Eastern Empire, that picture was wrong, and that these institutions were quite remarkable, where significant resources were invested in making them institutions that were a point of pride for the society that created them, where emperors repeatedly drew attention to the investments that they made in them, to the functioning of these institutions, and where their directors sometimes were very powerful political officials at the court, by virtue of the fact that they were placed in charge of these institutions. But this is something like the picture that emerges from a now classic study of the birth of the hospital in the Byzantine Empire written by Timothy Miller, originally in 1985. So I read it when I was in graduate school, and it blew me away. It was not only the extraordinary things that these institutions did, and in this particular case, the hospital, but also the extraordinary details that Tim uncovered in the course of his research. And little things like Byzantine doctors being given certificates of passing examinations on the works of Galen. And I was fascinated by these and tracked down the sources, and sure enough, they said exactly what Tim says that they say. But on a different level, at that time, the book helped me think about the combination and articulation of cultural elements that together made up what we then called Byzantine culture. Think about it this way in terms of the hospital specifically. In the sense of how they combined Roman, Greek, and Christian elements. So specifically, many of these institutions were attached to or associated with monasteries, where the monks would provide a service function which was part of their general mission of caring and service and charity toward the rest of society. But at the same time, the purpose of the hospital was not simply to care for people while they waited to die, but to actually provide medical care. And that was provided by specialist doctors who were not the monks. Functions were kept separate, and actual doctors in wards and wings designated for different kinds of conditions, different sexes, were trying to care for their patients, make them better so they could leave. And all of this institution was often structured as an imperial institution that is funded by the state, organized, that interfaced with the political apparatus at the court, which provided a great deal of the organization. Without any one of those elements, this would not have come together in quite the way that it did. And this offered me a kind of model for thinking about many other things in this society that tended to combine elements from this very rich and diverse patrimony that the East Romans had. Now, Tim then went on to write 2 more books on this topic. One of them was on orphanages, and more specifically on the famous orphanage of Constantinople, which was located just north of the palace on the Acropolis of ancient Byzantium, so more or less roughly where the palace of the later Ottoman sultans was based. And the director of the orphanage was at times a very important political official. And he then wrote another book on institutions for housing and caring for lepers. And so altogether, Tim has provided this wonderful triptych of philanthropic institutions throughout Byzantine history, and is certainly the foremost authority on that side of the culture. He also writes in a very accessible way and makes the issues in the sources very clear in all three books. And recently, I was reading through the Cambridge Companion to Constantinople that our colleague Sarah Bassett recently edited. Thank you for that, Sarah. And Tim had a chapter in there kind of summarizing his findings over the course of so many decades. And I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity for him to kind of present a small part of the data that he has found. You'd have to read the books to get the whole picture. But I also find him very eloquent and engaging when he's speaking about this material, and he's also a very generous scholar. So I really was looking forward to this conversation, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. So thanks again, medievalist.net, for reposting these episodes. And without any further delay, here's my conversation with Tim Miller. Hello, Tim. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, hello, Anthony. Hi.
So I'm very happy to have you on here. The other day I was reading Sarah's Companion to Constantinople, and I came across your chapter where you synthesize a lot of the work that you've done on the philanthropic institutions in Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire more generally. And you've worked on hospitals and orphanages and treatments of lepers and all kinds of things. And I thought it was time to have you on because you've produced a real critical mass now. I think you're the kind of expert in this field. You've done more than anyone else. And I also just wanted to say, just at the outset, that your book on the hospitals was a real inspiration to me when I was in graduate school. It really is an amazing book because it does all of the things that I wish, our scholarship would more commonly do, which is to synthesize evidence from such a wide range of sources in order to tell us something new that you would never guess from any individual source. And I just thought it was just a magnificent reconstruction based on that. And, I know that, so the picture of hospitals that you paint, it was pretty revolutionary. Like, I don't think anybody realized that these institutions existed way like that. And I was just thinking that, imagine if you were to tell someone that the, Byzantines had flamethrowers and hand grenades, which they did.
Yeah.
If the evidence for Greek fire had never been put together, and you had to introduce that as a new thing in the field, just how odd it would seem, but nevertheless entirely real. So I just wanted to say that it's an amazing book. I'm glad it's also been translated into other languages too. So let's dive into the welfare services and philanthropic institutions. Could you start off by telling us a little bit about the institutional framework in which these operated? That is, what kinds of institutions were these from an administrative and financial point of view, especially in relationship to the other institutions that the audience might know, like the state and the church and so forth? Like, who ran these things?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question, and it changes with each type of institution. But basically, they all spring out of Christian institutions. The Christian church promoted helping its own initially in the first, second, third century. The bishop kind of ran on informal charity. But then with Constantine's conversion and then the huge change of the empire in the fourth century, the Christian church had to expand its operations. And also they benefited from it. Peter Brown's book is good about that the bishop steps forth as sort of the patron of the poor. And you have all these new people coming into big cities like Constantinople and Antioch, where the polis structure really couldn't handle them. And so the bishop sets forth this kind of representing the poor, and to take care of specific types of problems, he supports these hospitals, orphanages, and leprosaria, and even these things called xenodokia. We would translate that as hospice. But, that's the one thing I haven't dealt with. Kitzinger out of Austria has written a real good article on them. But I don't want to talk about them too much, except to make distinctions. But anyway, the Christian Church both did it out of charity to meet its obligations to Christ, but also did gain political power. And one other feature, I think that monastic movement has a lot to do with it, but what's called the urban monastic movement. I think I really did a lot of work on that. I got a lot of it from Daguerre, that the urban monks, whom actually monastic historians don't really consider monks. I've looked into, talked to a few people that work just with monks, and they tend to ignore that urban monastic movement and see it more as sort of moving into those sodalities or lay organizations, pious organizations. So anyway, they play a role too, the urban monks, and then also a role is competition during the 4th century over the various factions with regard to the Nicene Creed. The Nicaeans fighting the Super Arians, and then you had the milder form of Arianism, and then a compromise imperial church that was not supposed to bother with it, And the result was a lot of competition to gain support from local populations for that particular branch of Christianity. So it is linked to Christianity, but also other issues involved in the polis structure. Then the other thing is the emperors. The emperors started giving money to these places, either land grants or tax exemptions or other things like that. But each individual institution will have other methods of support, but we can deal with them, as we look at individual types.
So it's my understanding that, a lot of the wealth of the church starting in the 4th century comes from imperial grants. Yeah, and some of it is earmarked for these kinds of services.
Right.
And the
so gave a lot of estates in Cappadocia to Basil to help build that big institution outside of Caesarea.
Yeah. So by the point that, let's say by the 6th century or after, when emperors are actively creating their own version of this, they're basically sort of drafting both bishops and monastic institutions into an otherwise centrally planned project that's funded by the imperial state.
Yes, especially with the Orphanatropian. It basically becomes a bureau of the imperial government.
Yeah, and you have secular directors of them,
Justinian. I was going to say one thing I didn't think of in the 4th century, and especially in the 5th and the 6th, the bishops get these grants from wealthy Christian lay people. Justinian changed the concept of that by allowing these private donors to continue to control the institution. There's several constitutions of his that do that, so that in that case, the founder of the philanthropy can determine who the head is going to be, the administrative head. Even after he dies, that power can pass to the heir. So that was Justinian, I think, done to encourage a lot more private donors. But that's another issue. So in those cases, it's not clear how much. Supposedly the bishop was always supposed to oversee them, but the actual ability to daily supervise was left to the donor and his heirs. So that was another issue too. That some of that's in my book on the hospitals, but it's very complicated.
Sure. Byzantine, you might say.
Yeah.
When you get into administration, these things get complicated.
Well, you might be thinking too, when you get past the 6th century, a lot of the big philanthropic institutions that we know about that become famous, like the Pantocrator and the Mongada, or and what was the one by Miro Leon? I think that was the one in the 10th century. They're founded directly by a particular emperor, and then he retains control of it. But he does give power over the institution to the superior of the monastery, to whom those charities are connected. As in the case of Pantocrator.
Right. The Mireleon you mentioned, this is Romanos the First in the 10th century.
Yeah.
Didn't he make a provision that it was supposed to provide 30,000 loaves of bread?
There's not a lot about that. particular institution, so I didn't use it too much. But it definitely was important because there's a couple of Zenon texts that were written by this by a physician at that particular Zenon, the one that's connected to the Myraleon complex. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know. He may have done that. I don't know.
Yeah. So you mentioned the urban monasticism, and just now you used the term complex. So I want to dive into that a little bit more, because some of these institutions are adjacent to monasteries, both institutionally and physically.
Yes.
They interface with them in some kind of institutional way. Can you talk a little bit more about that, or give some examples? Like, what do the monasteries have to do, for example, with a hospital, or
Well, the classic example I have, as everybody knows, is the one of the Pantocrator, but the same situation is true at the Mangana, which I have worked with just recently, so I know a little more about that than I do about Romanus's complex. But at the Pantocrator, you have the monastery and the superior who has control over the finances of the whole institution. So he can't choose not to. He has to give a certain amount to the hospital, certain amount to the Gericomeion, the old age home, and then a certain amount to the Leprosarium, but that was never built, but supposedly that was going to be there. And then in the actual hospital, the Zenon, the director, the nosokomos, is the one in charge of paying the people and buying the supplies. So by the description of the job, he wouldn't necessarily need to be a physician, but often after the 12th century, he is a physician. The people that run the actual medical aspect are primikerii in modern Greek. And those there are two of them, but they work in shifts, like the whole staff of the Pantocrator physicians, the medical staff. They go in these shifts. They work 1 month and they're off, so that whoever primikerios of the month is in charge of all the medical decisions. And actually, the superior is not supposed to have anything to do with that. So they're independent, not directly part of the monastery in the sense of the medical facility aspect of it. There's always this criticism made by the Muslim or the Islamic historians that only the Muslim hospitals were secular. And I maintain, no, the Byzantines are too, that the church is not involved in the activities of the physicians. For example, no requirement like there is in the West that a patient confesses sins. There's no requirement.
Right.
There's no requirement that they go to liturgy. There is a requirement that they participate in a procession. I think it was on Holy Thursday, in honor of the patrons. There's certain they have certain things that they're supposed to do to honor the Komneni founders. But as far as I know, they're never forced to pray. There's a chapel. I think there's two actually, one for the men and one for the women. But it's not nearly as forced as you get in the West. So it is a medical institution. And in that sense, independent. So that's why when I did hospitals, when I did that book, I had to go into Byzantine medicine so much.
Yeah.
And that's where you get in trouble, both me and anybody else that does it, because we're not trained in modern medicine, and it's hard for us to see what would be the goals. That's one of the reasons I've partnered up with this Edward Hopkins in Vancouver, since he's trained to be an orthopedic surgeon. He sees things in Greek Byzantine texts that I don't see. And, it's very important, I think, before certainly Byzantine medical history goes forward, to sort of get cooperation from the medical profession. They can add a lot because they see things that a person trained in Greek isn't going to see.
Right.
Like me, I never even took a biology course. I was told, take your Greek. So I had 2 Greek courses in high school. And for that, I didn't have to take biology or chemistry. So
yeah, I know exactly what you mean. The way I put it at a conference once, and this was on the reception of ancient Greek texts, and somehow or other, the conversation came to Archimedes. many of whose works we have. And the problem is that you could, until very recently, you could not easily find translations of them, nor studies of them. And of course, classicists never read these. And it's this paradox where you have like one of the most intelligent people who ever lived. He's never being studied because the people who can read his works can't understand what on earth he's talking about, because it's, fairly advanced mathematics. And the people who know the mathematics can't read the work, and they're not that interested in the history of the field usually. So it takes a peculiar combination of interest to get that.
And in the case of physicians, they don't make any money with the Byzantines.
No patents.
But this is another thing. I think it's hard for us, even though we know Greek, to get the subtle things. I've been working with this Paula Vagina text with Hopticon, and I will go through some of these words just using a men or a that, the whole thing in Greek with that. They're trying to say something that, even though I know Greek, I don't speak ancient Greek, and I didn't work in it with ancient Greek physicians to know little ways they say stuff. So to figure that out, you really almost have to sit down with a physician who can say, oh, he's trying to say. There's a couple of cases where Hopkins pointed that out. That one case, I'm trying to remember what it was. It was something to do with with one of the protrusions of the spinal cord, that it would wiggle, even and create a depression in the back. And he knew that and picked up what Paula Vagina was trying to say, but I didn't, because when this process of the spine would break, it wouldn't necessarily hurt or anything. It just gets a depression. Well, he knew that, see? And so he straightened it out, the translation, over some mistakes that are even in the one by Adams, which is very good because he was a practicing physician. He made it back in the 19th century. But that's the kind of thing you almost have to sit down with a physician, or in the case of Archimedes, with a mathematician, and talk about what the whole context is. So I'm not sure we have translations of Archimedes.
We do now. I think there was a team that was putting them
with a team. It would take a team.
Yeah. So let's get back to the institution itself. And we can come back to the medical things if there's time. I just want to make sure.
Right. Yeah, I just want to get that out of the way.
I want the audience to have a relatively vivid picture of what these things entail, because when we talk about the Pantocrator today, or the Miraidon or whatever, you think of the church, because that's the only part that survives. And so this is the church at the center of a monastic complex, but that complex included all of these other institutions as well. Right. So we're thinking more along the lines of something like a college campus.
Exactly. Yeah. How big it would be interesting to know. We don't actually know.
Yeah. With
campus would have been
the superior as a kind of provost figure or something running all of these different institutions. Right. So it's fairly complex. And what I liked about your analysis was how you talk about the different kinds of social values that are animating the different parties involved in these kinds of institutions. So there's a monastic, and there's the imperial, and there's a lay, and the medical, and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about those? Like, what kinds of values are represented here, and how do they all find this middle ground to make this thing work?
In the case, let's see, what particular one would I talk about? I guess the hospital, since we're dealing there. Yeah, you've got the monastery, which is trying to basically separate itself from contact with the world. So they don't want to really interact much, although they do. The one place where the monastery does interact, the head of the Gerokomion, the old age home, was a monk. But the rest of the staff are lay in that, and there is no monk involved in the hospital, to the extent that even if a monk is sick, John Comnenus actually wrote into the Typicon, no monk can come and use the hospital. So the hospital was completely separate. In fact, I kind of think the word xenon, one reason that catches on is it's the guests or the people that are strangers to the monastic community. That's one possibility. But anyway, so the monks were excluded. They had their own little infirmary within the monastery. And then, depending on the seriousness the level of physician would go in there to treat them. So there was a place where the first step of the ascent in the process of a student becoming an official life doctor was to go treat the monks. And then if it was serious, the primicarius would send better, more experienced physician. So the monks never came into the hospital. So that was a separate interest. And then, of course, the hospital is totally medical. There are religious ceremonies, but they're related to commemorations on the death of the founder and the family. And then there's something on Holy Thursday, a procession that I think all the sick are supposed to be part of. And I think there's one other, I think there's something on the feast of Cosmas and Damian also, as I recall. So there were some religious duties in the hospital, but nothing like in the West. No daily masses or anything like that. Let's see, is there another focus?
Well, about the hospitals, I mean, the values animating the hospitals, and I think this is important to stress because it might not be obvious to many people that the goal is to provide medical healing.
Exactly.
Right? Not just to sort of comfort people until they die or something like that.
That's very clear. In fact, I have that passage where it's very clear. Well, it's actually clear in the Pontificator. If someone in the Gerocomian gets a acute disease that's curable, he's transferred over to the hospital. But once he gets better, goes back to the Gerocomian. The Gerocomian is where the name is an old age home, but they evolve into hospitals for chronic cases. The one that Isaac, the brother of Isaac, the brother-in-law of Manuel, or maybe the uncle, he builds one. It's in Inus, over on the coast of Thrace, or near the coast of Thrace.
Yeah.
That particular typicon, the typicon survives, and it sets up a Gerocomian. But at no time does the founder Isaac call the patients there old. He calls them sick. And then he has a rule of how you release them. If they get better and can function on their own, they get their clothes back and whatever they came in with, and you discharge them. Now, of course, old people are also chronically ill. They don't get better, unfortunately, and they would be there also. So I think the distinction is Gerocomian is really a hospital for non-curable diseases. And that's one of the reasons why lepers sometimes sent to them.
Okay, we'll get to lepers in a moment. Let's start with orphans, because this was a remarkable institution too, and you wrote a separate book on them. So maybe we should focus on the Great Orphanage in Constantinople as a kind of ideal type. It's the one we have the most information about.
Yeah, we have almost no information on other orphanages.
So what children were placed in them and how were they cared for there and by whom?
Well, the institution comes from the 4th century. It's the oldest philanthropic institution in Constantinople. And that shows up by its being primary. It's always mentioned first. It has the privileges of Hagia Sophia. It was actually attached to the cathedral church, the bishop's church, then became separate in the 5th century. But this is the weird thing. From very early on, it always has a program of catechism to teach people Christianity. As early as the 9th century, they have the orphans participate in a service after Easter after they've just been baptized. So my impression is, it's not absolute, but my impression is many of the kids that end up in the orphanotrophion are war orphans, either from the northern borders back in the 5th and 6th century, from the eastern borders. And then we know, because it says specifically, Alexius brought back to Constantinople around 1200, a little bit before, after 1100, brought back a lot of orphans whom he had picked up in his campaign. And many of them were either Turks, Turkish orphans, or Greek orphans whose parents had died and who have never learned the faith. Because it says that as it gets back, they divide the orphans, and Anna Komnena talks about it. One group has relatives, so they go to their relatives. The other group has had some Christian training. They go to monastery orphanages, small ones. But those who have no training go to the Orphanotropheon. So that's why there's always a catechetical program there. There's always someone in charge of teaching Christianity to these kids. So that's an interesting aspect. And of course, Anna Komnene mentions all the foreigners there at the orphanage, the Turks and the Scythians and the Franks. Of course, they're not Christians, but they're in there with other foreigners. So, and then, which I showed you, we talked about this. I did a new introduction to that orphan book last year in the paperback edition, and I found the example of Hagia Theodoretos, who was the prime minister for Manuel I, that he was an abandoned baby. Now, you pointed out he might, I was thinking after we had that conversation that he might have been abandoned to a monastery. There's no proof that he went to the orphanage. But at some point, he ended up in the orphanage school because he goes on and on about what excellent, or it's actually Manassas' story about it, what a wonderful education he got in rhetoric and, all the good things that you get out of a high-class education, best teachers in Constantinople. And then he ended up joining the staff of the palace and rose to be the prime minister. So I was not aware until having read that little story that graduates of the Orphanotropheon could move up in the secular bureaucracy. I knew that graduates of the Orphanotropheon frequently became bishops in the clergy, but I didn't realize lay people could too, but there's at least one example of that. So it tended to get, I would say, foreign babies or foreign children, war orphans, and then also abandoned children, either directly to the Orphanotropheon or to some brevetropheon attached to it. I think Anna does picture women, wet nurses at the Orphanotropheon. So they don't say anything about that, but it's mentioned in her description. And then you have the story of Hagia Theodoretos having been a brephos when he entered. So yeah, that's a very interesting institution, and it was taken over by the government by, I think it's Nicephorus I. It had been under the patriarch, but it becomes a government agency, really. In the Orphanotrophos is a paid government bureaucrat,
Yes, and just the sheer longevity of this. I mean,
yes. I was thinking about that. Let's see. Oxford goes on about how old is Oxford? 1,000 years. But if you're a graduate at the Orphanotropheon,
right,
claimed, let's see, 13, well, it didn't last much into the 14th century, but you still will be 1,100 years, I think.
Well, by the time Hagia Theodoretos, is at the peak of his career, he's a graduate of an institution that has been around for almost 800 years. I mean, that's incredible.
I thought the same thing. They have pictures of famous teachers on the wall, all that kind of stuff.
Yes. Oh, the kind of lore that place kind of acquired that we just don't have. It's such a pity. Yeah. I mean, I really would want to know, what the inside culture was like. Anyway.
Yeah. Now, I told in the book, I think I pointed out there's one example of a homosexual relationship. And it's used to make fun of this guy, but not because of the homosexual relationship, but the fact that he couldn't extract himself from that. He didn't grow up, as it were. So there is some interesting thing in that. I can't remember who wrote that. It's an attack on. It's in the book, an attack on somebody this guy doesn't like. He's a bishop now, and he's
inevitably
his continued homosexuality that began in the Orphanotropheon, and that's not criticized, but the fact that a person grows out of that's sort of an old Greek idea too, it goes all the way back to classical Greece. But there's that one account of that. Oh, there is one story. There's another orphanage that's really interesting in Navpaktos. Let's see, it's John Apokafkos is the bishop.
Yes.
And his letters, actually, I owe that to Martina McGrath at Dumbarton Oaks. She found this. He's got 2 or 3 letters in there describing his orphan school. It's a school that the bishop is running, out of the cathedral church there. And he says flat out, the orphans hate me. They can't stand the discipline I'm giving them. Then he goes on how they need whippings more than they do.
Oh,
And then he has one orphan that he gives some job to do that he actually likes. I think he'd been his godfather, so he was abandoned, as a little tiny baby. And so the bishop raises him, but the kid never does what he's told. The story as it unfolds is quite clear that any job he gets, he does a bad job. So he finally sends him to another bishop and says, look, see what you can straighten them out, So you get a really good picture of what it's like to raise little humans, in that. In those three or four letters, actually.
Yes. I have a soft spot for Apokavkos because I spend part of the summer in Nafaktos.
Oh, really? I've never been there.
It's a beautiful location, and it's a wonderful little town, and it's got everything. It's right on the water at the narrow point of the Gulf of Corinth, so the Peloponnese is right there. It opens to the Corinthian Gulf, to the Ionian Sea. There are mountains right behind it. There's so much fresh water. Nafaktos, they're like all these public fountains where there's all this clear water, cold, is just running down from the mountains, and you can go fill up. And it's just a wonderful location. And now Apokavkos, I know, was a difficult person, and he got into fights with like all these people. But every time I'm there, I just kind of think about him because he's the one, important person from the whole of this history that we know was there, and we have all of his letters and so forth. And I always keep wondering whether his episcopal residence was here, or there as I'm walking around. It's really something. Anyway, so you also found some evidence that the orphans were like trained to sing in choirs.
Oh, that's super important. Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. Not only that, and now this is the interesting question. It starts a tradition because the first mention of it is in the 5th century, that the people of Constantinople go out on Sundays to listen to the orphan choir. And so that's the first example. But then, we know there was an orphan choir that sang for imperial services. And the only place, it doesn't actually say I think it actually says from the orphanage in one of the passages, but other ones, it just says the orphan choir. And so there's that. And then there's a commentary by Theodore Prodromos on singing on different songs, what do you call those? Canons that were sung during the liturgy, but not from the service, not from the scriptures. So not psalms, but anyway, commentary. And it was written for the orphanage. And then you have the Orphanatrophium in Rome, which was built in the 7th century, and it's called Orphanatrophium. It's not a Latin word. That evolves into the Schola Cantorum. Only that, as late 12th century, the orphans in Rome at the Schola Cantorum, by then it was called that, sing hymns in Greek, which nobody knows. It's been transcribed in the Latin letters. So the tradition of the Byzantine singing continued in the Schola amongst the orphans. Now, by that time, they might have been taking other, paid non-orphans, but that becomes a problem. But I don't see that in Constantinople, but it might have happened there too, that rich people knew that orphanage was so good, they paid to have their kids get in there. I don't know. But anyway, in Rome, then you get the tradition of conservatories. In Italy, conservatory is a orphanage. It's a conservatorio where you conserve the kids from the temptations of the big city if they're orphans. And of course, it becomes synonymous with a music school. So yeah, that music tradition, whether it has the origins by copying from Constantinople, certainly in Rome, that's true. But is it that taking care of kids and giving them something they enjoy doing is often related to music? There's an African-American orphanage in Charleston, formed right after the Civil War, where they did marching dances. And the Charleston actually comes from this, for a dance that the orphans of this African-American school did when they would dance in Charleston. It became famous all over the country because they would march in different parades. So there's another example, but is that a sort of human nature, or is that a copying from Constantinople? I don't know.
Right. Well,
That's a big
anytime
thing with music. I'm sorry.
Yes. I mean, when we think of orphanages, we usually think of very sad stories and institutions that are underfunded and kind of decrepit, and right. But if this is a prestige institution in Constantinople, it's very well funded. Emperors and bishops and so on are using it as a display for their philanthropy and so forth. I can easily imagine, people wanting their kids to be raised there, and anything you have something prestigious in Constantinople, you will soon start having honorary orphans, titular orphans, orphans who are paying to be orphans.
Yeah.
Anyway, just like with all the offices. Okay.
Yeah,
so
I thought the same thing. In every single Byzantine philanthropy, it's so well run, or at least seems so, that probably, well, we know in the Pantocrator, they're the example of Irene, the sister-in-law of Manuel I, the reigning emperor, goes to the hospital in the Pantocrator. It's in that poem by what do they call him? Is it Tocotron? One of the poets. No, the manga poet.
Yeah.
Who all these poems.
Ganios, yes.
They're supposedly coming out soon, in an edited edition. But anyway, got a typescript of it. And the interesting thing is the guy that's with Irene, who is this poet, I guess he was accompanied her to the hospital, complains about how long they wait for the physicians to come. So she doesn't seem to get any special treatment. She has to wait.
Right.
Then there's that funny scene where the teaching physician shows up accompanied by the two students, and the poet makes fun of the teacher as being sort of a windbag and really likes the two students. They're the ones that actually help Irene feel better, with their prescriptions. So that's interesting but see, that also guarantees the quality of the institution. Unfortunately, if something's just for the poor, people don't take care of it. But if everybody benefits, it's really top notch. And the only question is, do the rich kids push the poor out of these things? And that I don't know. Apparently, there's some evidence of that having happened at that Hershey school up in Pennsylvania, which is an orphanage. I forget, it's Hershey, Pennsylvania. The families founded a famous orphanage. I met some kids from that, or graduates of that, and there was some problems there with too many elite families getting people in. And that happened also at a school in Virginia. The real elite school at Stanton, Virginia, started out as an orphan school for girl Episcopalians. Now it's a real swank school, probably costs $80,000-$90,000 a year to go to. So that's the problem. If you just leave something totally for the poor, sometimes the quality goes down. It shouldn't, but that's the way people are. But the Byzantines do seem to have been aware that you need to have kind of a mix.
Yeah, elite buy-in. So let's turn to the Leprosaria.
Yeah, the Leprosaria, I get into that. Actually, John Nesbitt from DO, the expert with the seals and coins, died early this year. He said, why don't you do the Leprosaria? Because they're often mentioned in there. And he and I decided we would do that. He had a couple of seals that were helpful. In fact, one of the seals is a famous seal from the 12th century. It's what the inscription is, the seal of the brothers of Zodicus. And John thought it was there must have been a monastery at the Leprosaria of Zodicus, but I couldn't find that. By the way, that's across the Golden Horn up on the hill. There was a spring up there, and it was walled off, and the Leprosarium was on that north side, not in old Constantinople. Mm-hmm. Right. But there's no monastery mentioned there, and we couldn't really figure that seal out. And about 2 years ago, a man named Dan Ganner published an article in Dumbarton-Oaks Papers showing that Basil of Caesarea, actually built a leprosarium in Caesarea, not a hospital. I had said it was a hospital. Other scholars have claimed it was a hospital. And we're blaming Basil for that mistake, because Basil wrote a letter to the governor of Cappadocia defending himself, because a whole bunch of landowners had complained about this, the Basilias, this philanthropic institution. So Bassett goes on, what have we done? You know, we built a palace for you when you come. It's a monastery, and we're taking care of strangers and sick people. He never said tokotrophion, and he never said tokos. Now, what Kenner has proven is that tokos is a euphemism for a leper. Often in patristic literature, like Gregory of Nazianzus uses tokos to mean the leper. Tokotrophium was a euphemism for a leprosarium. But Basil never calls it in letter 94 of tokotrophion or the residents of Toki. He says they're sick and strangers. So I don't want to say he lied. I mean, he's the father of the Eastern Church. But in that letter, he obscures the fact. And if you look at every other description of the tokotrophion by Gregory of Nazianzus, in funeral oration, and Cantor goes through a whole bunch of texts that come later that describe it. It was a leprosarium. So that opened up a door to me and John. And then we looked through some of Justinian's constitutions on charity. And there's one, I got it written down here. I think it's book 1. Anyway, it's in the first book of the code, the Justinian's code, which is ecclesiastical issues. In one of the entries, Justinian writes that people can donate property either to the tokotrophion, and remember that's a euphemism for leprosarium, or to the toki themselves, so the lepers. And that explains the seal, because according to Justinian's legislation, the lepers existed as a separate corporation with their own seal. And that would explain also why lepers had a lot of control over the resources of the institution. And we know that from the West, because when the institution transfers to the West, the lepers run it. They elect their own master. They control the property. They have to sign off on buying and selling. Actually, there's a law in that same codex, the one right before Justinian, by Emperor Anastasius, that says only in the case of tokotrophy do all the actual benefactors, the toki, have to vote on contracts of leasing or selling the property. So as a result of leper, what would you call it? Gregory of Nazianzus mentions it. Lepers seem to have a community spirit. They're bonded together by their suffering and their helping of one another. It's kind of a social contract idea forced on them by nature, that they transfer that into their institutions and in some cases take it over. Not so much in Constantinople, because the emperor always, has the oversight. But when they get to the West, the lepers literally take them over. If you read that book, Walking Corpses, the second part is about leprosaria in the West. And some of them, the lepers completely control. They elect their everything. They determine everything, selling, buying, appointing the priest, everything.
Now, so is this in part because other people don't want to get too involved in the leper community, or just want to stay away?
Well, the fact that some of them were quite wealthy, so there would have been incentive for, say, a clergyman to want to be elected to the master position. Well, we know actually in Genoa there was an attempt by the bishop to start appointing, favored clergymen to administer the leprosarium in Genoa, which was built in the 12th century. But the lepers, it took them almost 40 years, but they went to the papacy and complained about it. They hired lawyers. They actually got Pope. This was actually in the 15th century. Pope, which one was it? It's Pope, the famous Nicholas V that started the library. Nicholas V sided with the lepers and said, "Yeah, the bishop can't do this. That they're protected. They can elect their own leader." So that was a jealous right that, and the only way, now obviously in Byzantium they didn't elect the leader. The leader, at least in Constantinople, was always appointed by the emperor, before by the patriarch, but after 810 or 815 by the emperor. But the property must still have been controlled by the lepers there because they have the seal that they have to put on any kind of contract.
Right.
So the self-government aspect of Leprosaria is really fascinating and not studied. We did it in the book, John and I, but all the criticism on the book and all the reviews focused on things we didn't take into account on, disease factors. But the book is really a political book about running the Leprosaria.
Yes, and it is an aspect that I would encourage people to take another look at. Because we really don't have that much by way of sort of self-regulating kind of corporations, to use a term very, very broadly, in this society. And this is an example that you brought out that I think really, really deserves a closer look. So, Tim, we have a few minutes left, and I was wondering if you wanted to take this opportunity to talk more about the medical aspects, some of the more interesting medical treatments that you have found, buried in some of the texts.
Yes.
Or treatments that, seem to you innovative for that period, or just generally medical procedures that we didn't think they were doing, but you believe that they did, and so forth.
Right. The most famous one, or the one that I bring out as early as when I did the hospital book, is that operation for removing kidney stones. There's absolutely no medical text that talks about it, but there's the early 9th century account of the life of, is it Theophanes? I think the life of Theophanes, and it's edited with the big history of written by Theophanes. Anyway, he suffered from kidney stones, and the description of it, and I'm just going to paraphrase it here, is the physicians used carefully designed instruments, in the plural, to go in through the urinary tract canal into the bladder and cut up the stones so they would flow out. And the Greek does say flow out with the urine. So that operation replaced cutting in to the bladder to remove them. So this would be an operation wasn't discovered in Western Europe or developed until the 19th century. It's in France as part of the, what do they call that movement where they improved hospitals. It was developed around, I think, 1820, around there. So now that has been disputed because the medical historians only look at medical texts. They will not take seriously. In fact, bad about it, they won't take the Pantocrator or Typicon for what it says. It's not a medical text. And to their credit, there's literally nothing in any of the official medical texts that reflect any of the sophistication of the Pantocrator, or obviously of this operation of grinding down the kidney stones into smaller pieces within the bladder, so you don't have to cut in there. So there's one example, and that you just can't dismiss something like that. I don't think, out of hand, that it's not described. Now, the recently Edward Hopkins, after having read my article on Byzantine medical thought and practice that you included in the intellectual history of Constantinople, of Byzantium, it is. He looked at Paul of Aegine's chapter or work on fractures. Of course, he was interested in fractures because he's working to become a orthopedic surgeon. And he found a passage in a 19th century French surgical manual that said Paul of Aegina was the first person to develop a laminectomy. That's the vertebra around the spine that makes up the spinal cord. All those little vertebrae segments protect the spinal cord. And on the outside, in several places, it's a very thin bone. It's not thick. It's thick. Let's see it's thick on the inside, but on the outside, it has these projections. They call them processes that form the spina, the spines, the stickers, literally, or thorns along the spine. Those things can break, but the actual lamina can break, this little this ring where it's thinner. If that happens, and if as a result of the fracture, the piece of the lamina points inward and hits the spinal cord, you die within about 5 or 6 days. It'll kill you. It causes numbness first, but then eventual death. And if it happens in one up on top here, the top vert in the neck, it happens real quick. Now, in Paul Avicina's section on fractures, he mentions repairing that surgically. Now, as Hopkins pointed out, there would be no way that anybody looking at the surface of the body would know that was broken. So they had to die first. And then when they died, the physicians opened up the spinal cord and found in enough cases that it was because of this inward turned lamina.
Mm.
So what I think pretty clearly Hopkins has proven is that physicians prior to Paul Avicina had been performing post-mortem autopsies. Now that's recorded in Procopius with the example of cutting into the buboes on the patients. So we know that was being done.
Yeah.
But they didn't really know much from that. Of course, they didn't know anything about bacteria or any of that. So, but they could see a broken bone sticking into a spinal cord.
Yeah.
And his theory is that that was a new kind of teaching going on probably in Constantinople as early as the 6th century. It really would have had to have been in a hospital, although I guess that can be argued otherwise. We don't have any proof of that. But where else would you know what the symptoms would be leading up to the death? Namely, numbness in the hands, vomiting, sickness, unable to feel below a certain part of the body, and then death. And then you would open up the spinal cord and see, oh, below where this impingement occurred, he couldn't feel, he couldn't go to the bathroom properly, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's the problem. And so we need to perform an operation to fix that. So I think that's what I'm really working on now. And actually, Edward's got the article in at DOP right now. Hopefully we'll get that published because it really will be interesting to see the debate that engenders. It could be rather hot, actually.
Yes, I expect so.
To be out there.
And I very much look forward to that. And I sometimes suspect that this kind of information might have become available in a military context, especially military doctors who...
That I thought of that too, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially because Aretaeus of Cappadocia, who's supposed to be 2nd century, he did post-mortem autopsies also. I think I wrote to you about that a couple of weeks ago. There's a case in which he matches up different symptoms of dysentery with very precise internal lesions in the even locations of the intestine. And the amazing thing is Kudlian and Edelstein, both of whom did work in the early 20th century or mid 20th century on Aretaeus, didn't notice that. It's been noticed, but again by physicians. An Italian physician writing in Siena. That's how I found about it, because I read Italian pretty well. So somebody sent me a book by a guy I never heard of, Giorgio Weber, who is an anatomist at University of Siena, and he wrote a book about it, which no historian of medicine read.
I remember when you told me about this. And
yeah, now his scholarship, as far as I can, but he had to work from Latin. He knew Latin, but he didn't know any Greek.
Yeah.
And I've read it too. And I don't see how you would know the lesions matching the symptoms that occur while you're alive, unless you went in and cut into the intestines and found these strange lesions. So that's another unexplainable thing without some kind of physician working with it. And I know he might have worked in a military hospital. That's why I wanted to back you up on that. I've thought about that too, because we know they had pretty fancy hospitals.
Yeah.
There. And he would be in that time, although some people say he might have worked in the early 3rd century, but we don't know too much about the legions, what happens in the 13th, but at least the early part, they might still have had fancy hospital somewhere.
I want to emphasize this point because it brings us full circle back to the comments that I made at the very beginning, which is how you do this wonderfully synthetic work. And, working, for example, on hospitals and medical treatment, but not exclusively from the medical texts.
Right.
Which is, I think, so important that you look at hagiographies, for example, or Typica or whatever, because I've had the similar problem as you have had with the medical historians who, use the medical textbooks, with legal historians who focus on the legal texts and the codes and it's kind of weird, don't believe that anything actually happened legally if it's not in the codes. And that's just clearly not the case. And there's one flashpoint of controversy is imprisonment, as a punishment rather than as a temporary holding facility before the actual punishment is imposed or trial. And legal historians will just keep insisting that in the Roman tradition, that imprisonment is not a proper punishment. And you look at, and then you have the historians and the hagiographers and the papyrologists and everybody saying, but no, clearly in these sources, it's happening. And you just have this impasse between these two groups who just can't seem to get over it. Anyway, that's a good place to wrap it up here methodologically. Tim, tremendous gratitude for all of the work that you've done. You've opened up so many fascinating facets of this culture. So I'm looking forward to the next one that you find.
All right, thanks. We'll see what happens in the next year.
Yeah.
Goodbye now.